Hey, welcome back to Dad Talks. I'm Karl, and this is Pastor Jesse.
What's up, guys?
That's how we're going to call each
Pastor
other.
Karl, Pastor Jesse. I like it.
So, Jess, today we're talking about marriage, and coincidentally enough, you just preached on marriage here at Flatirons, so you have all the answers.
My wife would say that.
Yeah.
She's like, why did you teach on marriage again? Why couldn't you sit and learn during that one?
We rock. Honestly, when we were planning this series, I was like, and I told Jen, and she's like, don't do the marriage one. That you're not allowed to do the marriage one. Yeah. So you got it. This one, dude. Marriage. We talked about this last time. If you didn't get a chance to watch the last episode, go back and check it out. We talked first about like kind of placing marriage on a pedestal, and like in the Christian world, like it's almost an idol.
Right.
It's almost an idol. But you took a different kind of angle towards it in your message of talking about like what does it look like to work together, like this kind of cooperativeness, like a 2-second synopsis of like what the heart of that message was.
Sure. So often what happens is we experience tension in our marriage. And we feel like, man, my marriage should be easy if it's good. Like a good marriage should be easy. Yeah. And actually the Bible created marriage as it's something that's filled with tension. And that's actually a good thing because that tension is created to help us become the people God's intended for us to be. And so the big thing for the message is just how do you get on the same page? And I think like we got questions in, we had conversations in the lobby. It's like people are asking like, how do I get on the same page with my spouse? Karl, what's a time where you and Jen have not been on the same page?
The one I distinctly remember early on in a marriage was literally laundry. I was like, we have dirty clothes, right? And she begins to do the laundry. And because I'm a dum-dum, I'm standing over her shoulder like, hey, that's not how you do it.
No.
This is not how you do it. Like, and I have no role in it, but I'm like, what's going on in there? And so then she turns around and she's like, hey, you can do your own laundry. Like,
100%.
But it was instantly like, oh, both of us had different ideas how this little thing was gonna work out. And 16 years later, I'm like, I don't care, like do how you do laundry. But I remember that the conflict of that being like, what I thought in my head, and I said it out of my mouth because I'm dumb, is you're doing this wrong.
Sure.
Like so
that always works for me.
So that was our acceptable. First big piece of conflict. All right, what was you and Kara's like?
Earliest one, I just remember the dishes in like, I'm not sure why it was this way, but the dishes just piled up. And I think that like both of us just lived at houses where someone else did the dishes. Yeah. And so we're just like, we're just going to leave them in there. And then we run out of forks. And you kind of hit this moment. It's like, who's going to do the dishes? And my dad worked, my mom, she stayed at home. Yeah. And so she did a lot of the dishes and dad would help clean up and all that stuff. But mom typically did the dishes. And so there was this expectation in my mind, oh, moms and wives do the dishes.
Yeah.
But Kara's working a full-time job. She, at that time, was working probably more hours than I was. And at the same time, I'm like, well, wives do the dishes. And kind of for me, what I realized is, no, husbands also do the dishes unless husbands sleep on the couch.
That's a fact, Jack.
And I think for us, like that was just one of the early times where our expectations of each other, they were unspoken, and unspoken expectations are just killers.
Yep, they're unspoken, always become unmet, and then
that's good, Karl,
right?
Unspoken, you should preach that. That was good. Unspoken, unmet,
and then it becomes a problem. But tell me, like think through this just with me, but let's move from like the funny things, like those are laundry, dishes, they're big deals, but in the grand scheme, one of the questions that we got in was like, my husband doesn't want to read his Bible solo or together. So now this gal is like, here's this I'm reading through this, like what I would see is like, here's an expectation that I had.
Right.
Maybe they met at church, maybe they met here at Flatirons. He's going to read his Bible. And maybe her dad, she would come down the steps in the morning and she would see her dad reading the Bible. Like, what would you say to that gal? She's like, my husband doesn't want to read his Bible, whether he's with me, whether he's alone. That's a real thing. Right. We actually hear pretty often. What would you
when
say there?
They're on opposite sides of the page. Yeah, I think, man, I've got just some tenderness there to say, like, these questions represent people. Does that make sense? People who are going, like, I want this from my spouse, and he's not being the spiritual leader that I hear about here at church so many times, and he's not doing that. And so there's a lot of tenderness for it. And at the same time, I think typically for me, you tell me if it's true for you, when I have an unmet expectation or a need or a desire, I'm going to like, the way I'm going to try to get it met is whining, playing the victim, criticizing, or being passive aggressive. Right? Yep. And so it's just like, hey, this is what I'm going to do to try to get you. And what I would say is, if you want your husband to read the Bible, how would you incentivize him reading the Bible? You laughed, Carl. I'm not. I mean, like, well, there are some very real facts that would make it pretty easy to just be like, so if we read the Bible together, that will happen.
Yeah.
I would like to read multiple chapters. Okay,
let's start with Song of Solomon. Let's go. That's for the Bible nerds. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think that, like, that's one thing. You know, like, I said it this weekend. We're like two-legged dogs, okay?
Yeah.
Like, you just reward us one time, and we're like, oh, that's what I got to do to get rewarded? Like, so I do think that there's incentivizing, and then I also think that there's a part of, like, how are you living? How are you responding to the word? How is God changing you through his word, where he goes, man, I want what she has. Does that make sense? Like, I think so often we can get stuck fighting or arguing about this thing, when in reality, like, God wants to use that thing to transform your heart, transform your life. And if that's happening in your life, if you're just doing it on your own, he's going to notice that. But if you're just like, if this is the thing you fight about, and there's no development in your own heart, and there's no, like, reward for him at the other side of it, whatever that would look like, why would he want to read that Bible?
Yeah.
Right?
You almost showing him, let's move away from this specific couple, but, like, showing your spouse, really practically for me, when I've been in dry seasons of reading my word, like, where it's like, and what's actually been one of the things that draws me back to the Word of God is the example that Jen gives.
Wow.
When she's reading her Bible, or she's doing a Devo, and I'll watch over 2 or 3 days of her spirit being lifted, and then I'm like, that becomes attractive to me. Not Jen, she's attracted to me too, but, like, Christ in her, and then I'm like, oh, now I realized, I'm actually in a little desert. When it comes to my quiet time, and look how joyful she is. Look how fulfilled she is. Look how just at peace she is. So then I'm like, so to your point, it's like we can actually become a reflection for our spouse, and let my actions and Christ in me actually shine, so that person goes, hey, I want that.
And I think that's part of God's design in marriage, where he talks about being helpmates. There's a helpmate. And there's this picture of these two people are going to help each other develop together in a way they would not be able to develop alone. And sometimes that's, you see something great in them, you're like, man, I want to live up to that. I want to live into that. And then sometimes it's like they're seeing a level of selfishness in you.
Yeah.
And then you're seeing a level of selfishness in them. And then what we do is we always decide that their selfishness is worse than ours.
Of course,
right?
Yeah. And we're always judging everybody else's sin.
And I think marriage is this crucible where we really, like, I know for me, I didn't know how selfish I was until my attitude, my decisions, they all landed on somebody else. And then I realized how selfish I was. And so, like, marriage has been this, at this point, 18-year process of God kind of trying to rip selfishness out of my life and trying to be selfless. But like, man, it is so hard when you go, like, I hear the thing so often, a lot of time from guys, oftentimes from ladies as well. They say, like, but I have needs that they're not fulfilling.
Yep.
What do you tell the person who's like, hey, I have needs and they're not fulfilling my needs?
First, I would, if a dad talks, so I'm talking to my 25-year-old daughter. Let's say she is, and she's like, or son, and he's like, Dad, she's not fulfilling my needs. The first thing I'm going to ask him is, where are these needs based out of? Are they based out of your desire, or are they being birthed out of something that Christ has put into you? Like, I mean, like, just
tell me more.
Like, because I think oftentimes there's preferences that I have, and I'm going to place those preferences on my wife and be like, this is something you're supposed to do.
Sure.
So really the root question I'm asking, I'd have him be asking himself is like, and this is a big Christian word, but just follow with me. It's like, is your request righteous? Is your request like this thing that you're saying you need? Do you actually need it? Do you actually really need it?
Sure.
Is it helping to serve her? Is it helping to serve your marriage as a whole? That's where I'd want to like really dig into that, because oftentimes needs, for me at least, more than often are actually selfish.
Sure.
More than often they're selfish. So again, when we're talking about things being rooted out, I want to root out as much of the selfishness as possible. Now, the needs that I have that I'm like, sexual needs.
Sure.
Okay, like there's two people, you're married, it's like, oh, I have sexual needs.
Right.
All right, but we've got to be on the same page. That's what I'd be asked. I'd tell them, I'd be like, hey, are you and her on the same page?
How would you tell people to get on the same page? I think this is an important conversation in Christian marriages. How would you tell people to get on the same page when it comes to sexual needs?
Have the awkward conversation over and over and over again. I literally think you sit, don't do it. It's not when you're in bed. That's not the time to talk. Like, yeah, right?
You're like, it's been 5 days. And
no,
like,
it's like, we talk about this a lot, about being vulnerable and transparent here as a staff, as a church. I think it's being honest.
Yeah.
Having an honest, vulnerable conversation of like, and it's not going to happen overnight.
Right.
It's like, I remember when we began to have those conversations.
Yep.
And it was like, oh, I didn't know that was so important to you. I didn't know that was so important to you. I didn't know that was weird for you.
Sure.
You know, or you had some baggage from that. Like it was in actually the conversation. And then I'd say this too. It's gonna get better. Like I've been yelling this at the rooftops. Like, if you told me 16 years ago that our sex life would be better, 16 years, I would be like, no way.
Sure.
The reason it is more honesty, more transparency, more awkward conversations that were like, hey, I think just talking. That's probably what I would say.
Sure.
Yeah. What would you do?
So Kara and I had to settle on a number. So basically in our house, there is a baseline kind of number in, you're like, what's the number? I'm not going to share this. We might cut this anyway.
Yeah, we're going to have to really look at the edits on this one.
But part of it is like, my expectation might be like, oh my gosh, like I think in marriage, we should be having sex every single day. And her expectation might be like, no, I like once a month's fine with me.
Yep.
And if she's operating from once a month, I'm operating from 28 times a month for February, but 28 times a month, there's a disconnect there. And so we've got to say, like, what seems like, and not reasonable. Sometimes I think like it's this tug of war, like, okay, I got to give, you got to give. No, like for the marriage that we want, what's the right amount of times that we should be intimate together?
Yeah, that's
and
good.
like when we have that conversation, and some weeks it happens more than that, and some weekends it happens less than that.
Yeah.
And I think for us though, it's more about like, it's about health and it's about having a thriving marriage, not about like, well, what he wants and what she wants. Does that make sense? Because I think
100%.
she and I, when we're on the same team, then we can look at the sex conversation very differently
100%.
than anything else.
Okay, so neither of us have been married 20 years yet.
Sure.
So, and I know both of us have couples that are in our life that we look up to.
Without a doubt.
So like, let's talk to the future. Like, what's been something that you've seen in a couple that's been married 40 years, 50 years, that you're like, daggone it, that like this guy has secret sauce, or she had, like, they figured something out. What's been one of those like gems that you're like,
there's a couple in particular that I'm thinking about, and the way that he admires her.
Yeah.
Like, you can just tell he admires his wife, the way he talks about her, the way he treats her. And we're just around when they're around other people, but it's like, I can just tell he admires his wife. And then the way that she respects him, and also like, and he's got fun idiosyncrasies and things that he says or does, and she just smiles and shakes her head. And it's not like, I think to make it that long in marriage, you go like, I'm going to accept this person for who they are, not just accept them, but like see all the good in them. And so it's like, I want Kara when we're 50 together, 60 together, to look at me. And there are some things that I do that are just like, she's like, she probably would rather me not do them.
Yep.
And I hope that she can look at me and just be like, oh, Jess.
I
love that guy.
I love that guy.
So,
He's still doing that.
How about for you?
I'm thinking of the pastor that married Jen and I, Pastor Bob and Janet. Like, we always said, I remember us saying this when they were doing our marriage counseling. We were like, they're an amazing, amazing couple. And all these years later, they still are. The thing that I saw them do was these gentle touches. Like, Bob was always grabbing. All of us have seen those, like you're walking in the park or at the mall or whatever, and you see two old people holding hands.
Sure.
And it's like the sweetest thing in the entire world.
Man.
That was Bob and Janet. That is Bob and Janet. And I remember seeing that and going, oh, like what he was articulating to her by just holding her hand is that, like, you're safe with me.
Wow.
You're secure.
Wow.
You're secure. And to be doing that for 50 plus years of saying the same thing over and over. Maybe that's the key. Is like, Bob has said the same things to Janet for 50 plus years, over and over and over again, right?
Sure.
Like, it's almost like he's still dating her.
Yeah.
And man, I want that so flipping bad.
Yes.
That we're that cute couple, walking through the park at 83 years old, like holding hands. Yeah, I don't know. Man. That's the thing for me.
That's good. Hey, I'm thinking about, like, one of the questions, and we get this a lot. I think we're still in process on this ourselves. When it comes to balancing work and home, work and marriage, like, what does that look like when you have like two big priorities? Obviously, like, your marriage comes before work, but in a very real sense, unless you're like born into a trust fund or whatever it is, like, you've got to work to be able to provide for this marriage.
Yeah.
Like, how would you help couples navigate prioritization of work and marriage, and then also just the practical aspect of it?
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word priorities. Life is about priorities. Sometimes people say boundaries, and that to me always gets so fixed that, like, there's no like, movement to it. From 9 o'clock in the morning or whenever I leave for work till 5:30, like, my priority is going to work. Like,
sure.
Like, that is I can't just be like, oh, hey, babe, let's just every day, like, let's just go to Boulder, let's go hiking and da-da-da-da. Like,
sure.
I would never say go hiking.
You like to hike. You look like a hiker.
Yeah.
So.
Right. But so it's like understanding that. But then the flip side is, like, there are moments where Jen's the complete priority. And doesn't matter if you call me or Jim calls me, it's like, nah, man, like, she's the priority. There are going to be seasons where there are moments in that where our kids are the priority, right? Like, we can't. Right. I see some couples who are like, they're so in love and their kids are a disaster. We're going to talk about that in the parenting message in a couple of weeks. But it's like, no, you got to, like, just continually know that there's a moment for this to be the number one and this to be the number one. But Jim says this all the time, which I love, is at the end, right?
Yep.
At the end,
it's just you and Jen.
It's just me and Jen.
It's just me and Kara.
And then one day, it's just me and Jesus.
Yep.
And you and Jesus.
Yep.
So I kind of hold those two of going, all right, that's how I'm going to make a choice.
Sure.
That's how I'm going to make a choice. I go, at the end of this, the kids are gone, the job's done. It's just me and her.
Yep.
It's just me and her. And then I know that one day it's just going to be me and Jesus. So I'm actually filtering everything through. It's just me and Jesus. So my relationship with Christ, than what my relationship with Jen looks like. So, but in a real practical way, I think you got to look at the stage of life that you're in, and again, unmet expectations.
You're right.
Articulate it. Like if you're in your 30s and 40s, this is like when you're ramping up your career. So you're working more because you want to get to that place where you're making enough money to have that life together.
Right.
So we've both got to understand that as a family, that as a couple, that we're going to make certain decisions today to allow us to be the best version of ourselves
that we want
in the future. Like you've just got to decide that. And then everything again kind of hinges back to identity. I'm going to ask myself that question. Is my identity in my work?
Wow.
If my identity is in my work, and here's the best way to understand if your identity is in your work. Like, do you feel better or worse about yourself based on how you perform at work?
Dang.
Right?
Carl.
Like, because that's me.
Right.
We've both lived through that. So if my identity is at work, that's instantly a yellow flag. Reprioritize.
Yeah.
Hey, you need to enter into a reprioritization season. Flip side, if it's just like, hey, babe, we're gonna just do us, and we're gonna live on a boat and walk around and the sand in our feet, and who cares? You haven't yet made the priority of like the life you want later on.
Sure.
Like you're having a blast in your 20s. But your 20-year-old self's not thinking about your 65-year-old self who's gonna need health insurance.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's like, hey, if we're always just doing us and vacationing and all stuff, maybe it's a yellow flag. Okay, what does this look like for me to be a little bit more serious about my career and what I'm doing professionally? I don't know.
Man, that's a great answer.
Yeah.
That's a great answer. Yeah, I think for me, when I think about work and when I think about marriage, Karen and I've this is probably the point that we have the most tension about.
Yeah.
And still even so, I remember being in this role for the first year. We had to have regular check-ins to go, this role, this season is overwhelming for us. I was not able to give Kara near the support that she needed with our 4 kids at home, but then also just any emotional availability. Like I remember I'm driving in the car with my son, Gray. He's talking about some video game that he's excited about or something. And like, we're going to get pizza. He said, hey, he wanted to come because who wouldn't want to spend time with his dad? And he's talking to me. And it's like the Charlie Brown, like, wah, 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 wah. Like I could not even focus on what he was saying because I was so in my head. And so we had to have these conversations. Does this role work for our marriage?
That's big.
And sometimes it doesn't. And like there was a commitment for us to say, hey, if this role doesn't work for our marriage, then I'm choosing our marriage and we'll have to find something else. But like we're always going to choose our marriage. But at the same time, if you're not having conversations around that, if you're not like having the honest discussions, then you can never figure that out.
Yeah. I don't know when people are watching this, but like for us right now, like Thanksgiving's in a couple months here. Where two families are coming together.
Sure. That's easy. Like
that. So that's one of the questions.
Sure.
That's one of the questions. Not just so. Talk to me about the blending of two families and how in a marriage do you make that successful? How do you make that effective? How do you make that good? Like there's Hod, Jim's always talking about that, but it's two becoming one. You and Kara, Jen and I. But there's also these whole bunch of people that come along with that. How do you manage that?
I think that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. Yeah. And I think when it comes to a spouse, there's a bit of like, whether it's give and take, whether there's developing together. I think it's so important to say your in-laws probably will not develop. Does that make sense? Like, I just think, I think when Kara and when our kids grow up, get married, I don't want to say we're not developing, but it's like, we're going to be who we are.
Yep.
My in-laws are who they are.
Yep.
My mom is who she is. Yep. And I love my in-laws. I love my mom. And at the same time, if I expect them to be something different than who they are, I'm always going to be disappointed. Like, how do you draw boundaries around it? I think that comes down to expectations. Just be like, hey, if like every Thanksgiving that there's talk about like arguments about politics or about like all these different things, and they're not the fun discussions about politics, but they're just like incendiary or whatever that looks like. I think that those are the moments where you say like, okay, we know what this is. And we can't change this. So how are we going to respond to it? But I think the issue with boundaries and the issue with in-laws is when we're trying to change them. And I think so much weight can be lifted when you just say, hey, I'm not changing them.
Yeah.
And they're not going to change. So how do I love these people? But then also, how do I set up boundaries to say like, man, we probably shouldn't spend a week together.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Like
Yep.
if this is who we are and this is what we want to do and this is who you are and you're not changing, then us being together for a week, that might not be the best thing for us or for you. And that's okay. There's not a right or a wrong to it. Like I think all of us have this idealized version of what a like extended family is going to look like.
Yeah.
And by and large, like I don't want to say it doesn't happen, but it's just like those are hallmark.
But it doesn't happen.
It doesn't. Those are hallmark cards.
Yep,
Right.
yep.
And I do think that that's the picture of like, I think it's Keller again who writes about we're homesick. Like the way we envision our family being is actually homesickness that's not from the past. It's actually from like the future and what we're going to experience in heaven, that's put inside of us, that infinity, that eternity has been placed in the heart of men.
Yeah.
And so like, I think that we're dreaming about what family and what heaven will be like when we're in heaven. But at the same time, I think just saying like, hey, that's not what we're going to experience now. And we can love and accept for who they are. But that doesn't like, I accept plenty of people in my life for who they are. And that doesn't mean they're my best friends.
Yep.
So,
Okay. This one was really a burning question. Somebody comes to, we've been married 10 years, right? Both of us weren't believers when we got married, right? Now he's a believer.
Sure.
And she's not.
Sure.
What do you tell that guy?
I would refer him to Paul, that Paul writes about, hey, if you're in a marriage and one of you is a believer and one of you is not. And like in the early church, that's actually what people were walking through, is like the church spread so rapidly that oftentimes one person in a marriage was getting saved, the other wasn't. He says, stay in that marriage. I would just encourage that person, like if you're looking at how you're different or how like you wish things would change, I don't think that's as helpful as just saying, how does God want to use you to be an example in this person's life?
Yeah.
How does God, if you've got kids, how does God want to use you to help these kids? And how do you make it non-combative? I think so often, like especially in today's culture, we just get combative with everything. And in reality, how do you take a posture of servanthood? And ask yourself the question, if Jesus was married to this person who wasn't a believer, what would Jesus do? And then I would just do that.
What would Jesus do? Just do that.
You just
You know
WWJD.
what? I like that.
Carl,
No.
as we're wrapping up, give a final word to just the married couple in the room who's struggling right now. We'll just give a final word and then we'll wrap this thing up.
To the married couple who's struggling, hold on. Life is seasons, and my father-in-law told me this. It's like, hey, this too shall pass.
Yeah.
This too shall pass. Hold on and go back, rehearse God's faithfulness of like those great moments, and understand like, hey, we're in a valley right now, but we're only getting out of this valley together. So we got to hold on. Something that Jen and I are praying through right now, literally, is we're saying this prayer. I can't, Jesus, you can. I can't, Jesus, you can. There are moments where you're going to feel like,
wow,
this is a disaster. I can't, Jesus, you can. That part of us holding on to one another, holding on to Christ, I think that's what gets us through those.
Man, so good. Well, Karl, this coming weekend, you're going to be teaching on parenting. I can't wait. Maybe next time I'll have some of Ruby and George's evaluation about what you say about parenting, how it's actually working or anything. So Flatirons, we love being with you. Make sure you check this out next week. Make sure you're here this weekend.